This is week 2 of the Torvalds Land Rune Priest Class. We continue on with standards in By the Book S.L. Torvalds Land. First thing we're going to start covering is the role of women and slaves. This is a role almost everybody wants to talk about, argue about, or hear about. Before I get into it, I'm going to be very clear that I am not going to say one way or another whether there are or there are not, or what the roles are or what the roles are not. There is no place for me to make a stand on that statement in any direction. I will, at the end of the section, give you a personal recommendation. Okay? So, what, if any, role do women and slaves have in Second Life by the book Torvalds Land? First, let's look at the quote. "It is the frenzy of Odin," said the Forkbeard. "It is the frenzy of Odin. Man by man, heart by heart, the fury gripped the host of Sven Bluetooth. It coursed through the thronged warriors. It seemed a tangible thing, communicating itself from one to another. It was almost as though one could see it. But one could not see it, only its effects. I could trace its passage. It seemed first a ghastly infection, a plague. Then it seemed like a fire, invisible and consuming. Then it seemed like the touching of these men by the hands of the gods, but no gods I knew, none to whom a woman or child might dare pray, but the gods of men and of the men of Torvalds Land, the dread, harsh divinities of the cruel north, the gods of Torvalds Land, and the touch of these gods, like their will, was terrible." This is the only quote we have that suggests that the gods of Torvalds Land are not for women, and it's certainly quoted by Tarl. Expanding on the question asked earlier in our frequently asked questions, we come back to the role of women in the role of Torvalds Land. We do not see any examples of Torvalds Land women praying, but we do see Gorean women praying. We see initiates praying on behalf of a free woman of Gore. Consequently, it's quite a bit of a stretch to suggest that free women should be excluded from any religious activities. It is more likely that it is a representation of this particular aspect of Odin that induces the frenzy. At this time, if you're listening to this class on audio tape, I would like you to please write down the keyword ver. We're going to move on to slaves in the temples. In Marauders, we see that there are eunuch slaves in the temple of Cassal alongside the initiates. We have no other quotes about slaves in the temples of the rune priests, but we have quotes regarding slaves not being allowed in the temples of the initiates. Portions of the hymn were taken up by 4 delicate boys standing outside the light rail on a raised platform. Their heads were shaved and they wore robes resembling those of the initiates. Choirs of such boys often sang in the great temples. They were young male slaves, purchased by initiates, castrated by civil authorities, and in the monasteries, trained in song. Quote, Marauders of Gore. "I have never been in one of these temples. Slaves, like other animals, are not allowed within it. It is felt that they would defile such places. They may wait, however, in the special, small, walled areas outside the temples, usually at the back or sides, where their presence will not prove distraction or offense to free persons." Dancers of Gore. Slaves, incidentally, as other animals, ver, tarsks, and such, are not permitted within the precincts of the temples, lest the temples be profaned. Prize of Gore. A free person might seek sanctuary in a temple, but a slave might be killed if found within one, after which the temple must be purified. Conspirator of Gore. As the inquiry of the man of Prestratius might have seemed to some readers somewhat anomalous, It should be mentioned that on Gore, slaves were not permitted in any public buildings, rather as any other animals would not be permitted in them. Accordingly, public slave rings were frequently available in piazzas, squares, forums, agori, and such, and along public streets, for the convenience of masters to which their slaves may be conveniently chained. One sort of building in which slaves was never permitted and may be slain if found within are temples. It is felt by initiates, the alleged representatives and servants of the priest kings, understandably enough, that the presence of a slave in such a place would be a profanation of sacred precincts. Provisions are made for their caging or chaining outside such places in nearby lots, removed to a decent distance. So the question to be asked to those taking this class is, if the premise of slaves not being allowed in the temple is because they are the equivalent to beasts, then the question I have to put to you in your sim is, would you allow animals in the temple? The answer to that should set the tone of your role play. The second question is, what, if any, value do slaves have to the gods? Can they worship? Would their prayers even be answered? Given this rather familiar passage from Marauders, I feel that we can safely assume that thrall, at the very least, was definitely seen as being beneath the interest of the gods. And if one is beneath their interest for sacrifice, they must surely be beneath their interest alive and enslaved. It is my understanding there might have been decided, however, a generation ago by one of the rare meetings of the High Council of Rune Priests, attended by the High Rune Priests of each district, that thralls should no longer be sacrificed. This was not defended, however, on grounds of the advance of civilization or such, but rather on the ground that thralls, like Erts and tiny six-toed Thalarian, were not objects worthy of sacrifice. There had been a famine, and many thralls had been sacrificed. In spite of this, the famine had not abated for more than 4 growing seasons. This period, too, incidentally, was noted for the large number of raids to the south, often involving entire fleets from Torvald's land. It has been further speculated that the gods had no need of thralls, or if they did, they might supply this need themselves, or make this need known through suitable signs. No signs, however, luckily for the thralls, were forthcoming. This was taken as a vindication of the judgment of the High Council of Rune Priests. After the council, the status of Rune Priests had risen in Torvald's land. This may have had to do with something that the fact that the famine finally, after 4 seasons, abated. The status of the thrall correspondingly, however, such it was, declined. He was now regarded as much in the same category with the Erts that won clubs in the Saturnicheds, or are pursued by small pet Sleen, kept there for the purpose, or with the tiny 6-toed rock Thalarian of southern Torvald's land, favored for their legs and tails, which are speared by children. The thrall had been nothing in Torvald's land before. He was now less than nothing. His status was now, in effect, that of the southern male work slave, found often in the quarries and mines and chained on the great farms. Marauders of Gore. While slaves in Viking mythology are believed to have been created by the god Heimdall in the disguise of Rig, Viking law did not account slaves as being people and classified them as property. I think it is likely that a rune priest would have little or no concern for the needs or affairs of slaves, male or female, and would reasonably expect them to sit outside the temple or in some logical antechamber. Further, I do not believe that rune priests would trouble themselves with if a slave called to the name of Thor or Odin, any more than they would respond to a child saying they prayed to the president. What is for women? I'm going to go on to this section, and then I will stop and we will talk about this. There are no examples of women as rune priests, nor any examples of them as initiates. Further, I have been unable to find any examples of women in the role of diviner or seer in the Korean books. However, during 2009 and 2013, there was a flood of female rune priests. It then became the custom for a while to insist that women wanting to be rune priestesses go by the title of vulva. I personally think this is swapping one non-by-the-book custom for another. However, I see no reason why a sim should not allow the adoption of such a title as vulva for women, but it does not represent a lesser position. In the Viking Age, the vulvas were of such high rank, the Jarl and his lady would give up the high seat for them. To me, the real question is, what, if any, duties were reasonable for women to perform? If we can offer a reasonable answer to this question, then I believe it is possible for women to enjoy a supporting role alongside a male rune priest. Before we make any such determination, here are some of our most commonly held beliefs, and then we will talk and we will debate it, and I will save the debate. Number 1, there are no rune priests and marauders, therefore the role was restricted to women. Conversely, unlike it is stated for initiates, the same restriction was never stated regarding rune priests, meaning they said there are no female initiates, but they never said there were no female rune priests. So that's part of an argument. Number 2, a man would never accept a woman intervening for him on behalf of the gods. 3, well, women hold positions in southern caste against tradition because in S.L. Gore, women are more likely to do the job. Torvaldslanders are not Vikings. Initiates may not be women. I have a bunch of quotes there. 6, given the huge role of women as healers, shamans, prophets, and magic wielders in Viking society, it suggests that there should be some role for women in Torvaldsland. Women shouldn't be called priestess because that makes them equal to men. Conversely, the title of vulva had a higher rank in the Viking Age than that of priest. Women have no role in Korean religion at all, neither as worshippers nor as priestesses. They do not gain any afterlife and should be excluded from any roleplay of this nature whatsoever. And yet, a free woman was allowed to offer sacrifice at a public festival. The more you read and learn about the cultural rules of Norse and Torvaldsland society, the better you will be able to adapt your roleplay to authentic expression that feels right in S.L. Gore. There are a number of books written on the subject, including the highly respected The Well and the Tree, World and Time in Early Germanic Culture. I have included a PDF of this 60-page document. It's on the website. If you find reading this to be a chore, don't worry, we all do. I get through about 10 pages of it before I have to go look up every term and concept just to adapt it. If you're going to look for any sections to which to put soon into your overly filled brain, then Section 1 and Section 2 are the primary ones to read, with the subsection of rituals and everyday life to be a priority. This book costs over $300 to acquire in the real world. We've done our best to provide you a copy, even if it's a somewhat difficult one to read. Unfortunately, it's turned on its side. So, good luck. I have a laptop. I pick it up and turn my laptop. Next one, Germanic spirituality. One of the things we see happening most in rune priest practices is the inclusion of modern heathen practices, Asatru, Wiccan, and even Christian practices. Don't do this. If you do not understand where a tradition comes from, this PDF on Germanic spirituality breaks it down heavily. While the author is not necessarily a traditionalist, he clearly documents the sources of traditions that came into it and what we learned to do on the website and in modern books of heathenry. I have eliminated most of the vast reading of the classes I used to teach, but this one is mandatory. Please start reading it. Quote, Germanic worldview attributed much to being on the inside. For the Germanic mind, in all things good and nurturing were of the inside. The inside was home, community, civilization, good fortune, love, and luck. There were strict social mores to bind the inside together as a cohesive whole. The Havamal is really little more than a set of rules which have their basis in maintaining a community together as a cohesive whole. Maintaining a sense of balance within a community was the primary purpose of the entire early legal system. So the sense of inside develops into a set of concentric circles, each being encompassed by the next. The center circle and the most inside is the family, encompassed by the community, which is then encompassed by the kingdom, which is then encompassed by the various local deities. Inside begins at the borders of the kingdom, which moves out deeper and deeper into wilderness. Inside to outside can be seen as a continuum on the radical cross-cut view, starting at the center with the most familiar, continuing outwards to the most foreign, or even at the most safe, out to the most dangerous. German spirituality, and there are two other sources and aspects that are vital to grasping the concept as is most necessary to the role of a rune priest. The Havamal. If there was one single source that we might look to understand the Viking code of behavior, it would be the Havamal, the 165 verses out of the Poetic Edda. The Havamal is by many accounted to have been the words of Odin himself and mean sayings of the High One. It is from the Havamal that the 9 noble virtues was developed in the 1970s for the Odianic rite. I do not recommend that the 9 noble virtues be used directly, as they are more modern in flavor than I think fits S.L. Torvalds Land. For example, a Torvalds Land honor system, you might wish to read the article written on honor. In regards to the Havamal, there are 2 relevant points to consider carefully. The first being the translation used. There are at least a dozen translations of which they have vast variations on what they believe the meaning of the original verses were. This is fine, as it's likely that there is also a point of discussion during the Viking Age as well, but do pick your version with some care. Secondly, most modern translations of the Havamal leave out verses 81 through 95, as they are a rather negative model on the untrustworthiness of women. And as much as I may support that decision in the modern era, it is likely far more plausible that they would have been contained in S.L. Torvalds Land. The poems in the Havamal is traditionally taken to consist of at least 5 independent parts. And you can look at this list here, 1 through 5, Proverbs and Gnomic Wisdom, a dissertation on the unfaithfulness of women, a collection of further gnomic verses, an account of how Odin won the runes, and a collection of charms. When we refer to the Havamal in modern heathenry, we are typically referring to the first 80 stanzas, called the Getspata or Havamal proper. You should know the Havamal well enough that you can identify when a quote from it might be applicable, and then open a copy of your PC to copy and paste. I've found that when I wish to softly advise someone on behavior, being able to slip in a quote from the Havamal works very effectively. Creation myth. The creation myth for Torvalds Land is very different from that of Norse mythology. And while those stories might be favorable sagas told around the hall in winter, as per the saga discussion we mentioned in the first week, The Rune Priests of Torvald's Land will hold to the creation myth from Hunters of Gore. If you're listening to this class on audio, your next word is ram. Please write ram down. Quote, in Gorean legends, the priest kings are said to have formed man from the mud of the earth and the blood of tarns. In the legends of Torvald's Land, man has a different origin. Gods, meeting in council, decided to form a slave for themselves, for they were all gods and had no slaves. They took a hoe, an instrument for working the soil, and put it among them. They then sprinkled water upon this implement and rubbed it with sweat from their bodies. From this hoe was formed most men. On the other hand, that night, one of the gods, curious, or perhaps careless, or perhaps driven from the hall and angry, sneezed, threw down upon the ground his own great axe, and upon this axe he poured paga and his own blood, and the axe laughed and leapt away and ran away. The god and all the gods could not catch it, and it became, it is said, the father of the men of Torvald's Land. Hunters of Gore. You will hear people refer to those of Torvald's Land as the sons of the axe. And most rune priests argue that it was mead, not paga, that was used. The Nordic worldview is holy rather than sacred, in the sense that it is holistic rather than sacred and set apart. While trying to understand the manner in which ritual, healing, divination, and magic are utilized, it is important to understand the holistic nature of the Norse mind. And while it is likely that Torvald's Landers have become more Gorean than the Viking Age people may have represented, many of the other cultures on Gore also stem from holistic worldviews. This next section that I'm going to get into is some of my earliest research. If I have made any exceptions to it or I've misunderstood it, I'll come back and update it. Let's begin by understanding the complex associations between body, mind, and spirit. There's an excellent detail on Carrie Toring's Volvastav manual. Body. The body complex is comprised of mot, mane, and ond, or more simplistically, flesh, force, and breath. The flesh and bone that holds the mind and spirit within. As fire and ice were the origins of the original creation for the Norse people, they believed that from this came rime, water, air, and as Ymir's body, the gift of earth, stone, and wood. From a Torvald's Land perspective, the first man of Torvald's Land was created from axe, paga, and blood, which we compare to the creation myth of the Norsemen, who were formed from an ash and an elm. Odin gave the man and the woman spirit and life. Vili gave them understanding and the power of movement. Ve gave them clothing and names. One might then suppose that it was the axe that gave them body, paga that gave them mind, and blood that gave them spirit. From such a blending of ideals as it relates to mot, we may say mot as the wooden handle of the axe. Mane is the old word for might and ability. Mane exists in both the spiritual and physical world and binds all together. Mane increases and decreases with physical and spiritual health. When death comes, the mot returns to the earth and the mane to the spiritual force of the universe, perhaps like the axe head that grows dull over use and sharpens with careful tending. On. On is breath, our use of breath. When Odin gave On to Ask and Umbala, the first of the two people in Nordic belief, he gave us inspiration, breath, animation, and changed us from the inanimate to the animate. Through the use of own, we might increase our main. Own may be seen as the intentional use of the axe, its ability to be more than an inanimate object, but instead one that might have leapt away. Mind. The body complex, perhaps the sacrifice of Paga, or mead, ale, as rune priests like to retell the tales, gives us Od, thought, and memory. I am reminded of a verse from the Havamal that says, "Less good than belief would have it is mead for the sons of men. A man knows less the more he drinks and becomes a befuddled food." Fool, not food. We don't eat them. We eat the cur. Ord represents our ability to think and reason. It's what grants us free will. Like the rune Thorasus, we shift from primal energy to conscious being, to choose between rash judgment and quiet deliberation. Wise is not he who is never silent, mouthing meaningless words. A glib tongue that goes on chattering sings to its own harm. The Havamal. Hugin, the thought, the ability for one to consider and to think of situations. Munin, memory, the ability to retain knowledge of past events. Without thought and memory, there would be no true intelligence. Hamar, pronounced Hamer, represents the astral body. It is via the Hamar that we travel spiritually, shape change, project charisma in a crowd, or protect ourselves from external spiritual forces, or even repel unwanted notice in public. La, an aspect of the spirit body which translates to charisma and physical warmth or spark, countenance, and spiritual purpose. Urlag, the physical, spiritual, and emotional accumulation of our ancestors, both kith and king. Our Urlag is also formed by our environment, both of ourselves and of our ancestors. This is the warp thread of the loom that cannot be escaped, that can be recolored by the weft we weave about it, the deeds for which they are noted, the suffering they have known, the honor they have held, and the lies they have spoken, along with all of that back to the line of your people. Haminga, perhaps the most important turn to learn. Haminga is the accumulation of the Urlag you receive from your parents and your own weird. Haminga is the manifestation of this, your Urlag, your likely destiny, what kind of luck you have, and the choices you make will affect your family and your family's Haminga. The web of weird. With a blending of cultures and the forgetting of our traditions, many have lost sight of what our ancestors believed regarding fate. The answer as to why things happen and what things will happen is complex. First, we must speak of the Norns. The Norns are the 3 women who live near the largest roots of Yggdrasil, where the well of Urdur lies. They are responsible for watering the roots of the great tree. Their names are Skuld, Verdani, and Urdur. It is at this place also where on the great plain of Urdur that the gods meet in council. Urdur is the older name for the term weird, some of you may have heard. The Norns represent the past, the present, and the future. First, to understand the view of our people, you must understand that fate is represented not by the Norn of the future, but the Norn of the past. This is perhaps the greatest difference in many beliefs that differ from ours. The Norn of the future is called Skuld. Her name translates to that of debt in our modern dialect. So think for a moment on a concept that has our view of our fate as being represented by the Norn of the past, and that of the Norn of the future, which means debt. Such a concept is almost backward to many beliefs, and yet it is core to our understanding of our lives and how they build and how they proceed. There is a concept called Urlag. Urlag and its associated terms represents all the actions, inactions, events, and even genetic traits of each of us all the way back to the line of our earliest fathers. So it is possible to say, I am who my forebearers were. I carry all of them with me. I weep for their losses and have joy for their successes. I have their luck. I have their pain. I am no more than a sum of a past that descends back generations. Our fate was formed in the past before we were ever born, but it does not determine our destiny. We carry with ourselves from the moment of our birth the pattern of all who came before us, all who were part of our family's Hamal. In this concept, this leads us to understanding the role of the future. The future, which is represented by the Norn skuld, also means debt. That we begin to see that our future is the foundation of our past, combined with the choices we make in the now, the Norn Verdani. We are meant to pay the debts of our ancestors in the future. That is not to say that our future is predetermined and that we cannot escape it. It is more to say that you must cross a river, and you have only a hammer but no axe. You have 2 sets of clothes but no rope. You have a horn but no shield. How do you choose to cross this river? Is the fact that you cross predetermined? No. What is predetermined is what you will have when you reach the river. So the question is, how do we understand our Urlag? And then how do we perhaps change it? Homage is a term we do not hear very often, but is the combination of our Urlag and collective unconscious of our ancestors. It is the one thing that we are saddled with, a past that is determined before our birth, but we are not alone in understanding this past. We have access to our ancestors. They can speak to us, they can guide us, and a skilled shaman can also speak with them. We cannot change our Urlag simply because we will it so. Our Urlag is. We cannot solely by choice change it. We must first understand it, or we will repeat the same paths that our forebears did. So look at it this way. If you came to that river with only those items defined, without knowledge of how your father crossed that river, it is more than likely you will choose to cross in the same manner as he did. So unless something else has guided you, then you will cross the same way as all of your fathers have crossed that river. Of course, our father is likely to be alive in our lifetime, and perhaps even our grandfather and his father, for we live much longer than our ancestors. But it is important to understand that we do not have free will without debt. We are a byproduct of our Urlag, and yet we have these 2 choices. First, we might listen to our ancestors or seek help with one of our people's shaman to understand a debt better that it might be paid or simply understood. The second way in which we may change our Urlag is by merging our Urlag with others. This is known as the web of weird. When Bane and I married, and when our marriage extended for so many long years, my Urlag and his Urlag changed, and we forged a new one for our children. When we brought in our adopted children, we changed their Urlag, layering ours alongside their birth parents. So fate is that which is expected to be your path, and destiny is that which you make of those expectations.